So if we were to go to our render globals, our render settings, and switch to mental ray, and then in here, let me just go and make a couple changes. So let's say we're going to render at 720p. Let's do that. And under quality, we'll just put it to 1. So just a generic, simple render. Everything in indirect lighting is off for now, but we'll end up using it. And I'll go and turn on my resolution gate. And let's go and get a ground plane in here. So we have a big ground plane. And for the ground plane, I'll just go in and put it on a layer and just make it a reference layer so I can't pick it anymore. And if we were to do a render now, there's obviously no lights in the scene, so we could go and for now just create a directional light. So there is one. And for that light, maybe I'll go and turn shadows on. So let's say use ray trace shadows. And let's open the render view window. And let's go and render that camera. And we get nothing. And so the reason we're getting nothing is because of the fact that this is PaintFX, and PaintFX doesn't render with mental ray. So if I went and switched to Maya software, and inside Maya software, let's say we turn on ray tracing so our light can cast a shadow, and we'll leave everything else the same. And let's go to the render view window and render again. And let me just give this a few seconds. All right, there you go. Rendered. So we get the plants, but you'll see that we're not getting shadows because it's not happy with ray trace shadows. And so it's wanting depth map shadows. So basically, I could go and take the light and switch to depth map shadows, and you get the point. It's that, okay, well, so it works with Maya software. You can see it rendered really fast, but that's not what we want. We have to get these things renderable with mental ray. So we're going to go and switch back to mental ray. And what you need to do is you need to convert these things to polygons. And that is very, very simple. So let's say we just go and grab one bush in here and let's hit F and focus in on it. You can see it already kind of looks like geometry. But the thing is that it's this procedural PaintFX engine that's being used. So to actually get it to be real geometry, you have to go to Modify, Convert, and then you'll see you have PaintFX to polys, NURBs, or curves. So we're going to use polygons. But before we do that, if I select that curve and go to the attribute editor, you'll see, and let's just scroll to the top, just close everything. We have our two folders, and you'll see that with them, if we go to the stroke shape, there's one called Mesh Output. And if we click on it, there's a checkbox here called Output Quads, and so which I'm going to turn on. So basically I want, when these are converted to polygons, I don't want triangles, I want quads. And so that's just a personal preference, is that I like having quads for these things. Also, you know, if you were to take one of these plants into, let's say, ZBrush, then if it's quads, you're going to get better behavior. So you might not do that with plants, but let's say for a tree, you might want to add more detail in ZBrush to it, so it being quads is a good idea. If you're going to want to smooth it, you're definitely going to get better behavior with quads. So whether it's via, you know, a mesh smooth, but I'm just converting all of these to quads. Brink. All right. Then I can go and select, let's say, one of these. We'll just grab that one at the top and go to Modify, Convert, PaintFX to Polygons. Let's go to the options. In here, I'm then going to also turn on Quad Output, and then you'll see you have this poly limit. So if the poly limit is too low, let's say I put this down to, you know, 395 polygons, and I convert it, it's not going to convert the whole stroke. It'll just convert until it hits that poly count and stop. So if I hit apply, you'll see what happens there. So really what I do is I just leave that at a large number. So to be safe, I'll put it to 500,000, hit apply, and you'll see it gets converted to polys. So with this stroke that we just did, you'll see now all of a sudden it looks different. And the reason is because it's now showing the shader and the texture that Maya created for that and showing the transparency, which the paint effect stroke wasn't doing. But you'll see that the stroke is still there. But when I select it, you'll notice that it doesn't highlight here. And the reason is because this has now been hidden. And if we scroll down, there's the mesh group. And if you open it, you'll see it gives you a different poly object for the main branch, let's say, the leaves, and what are considered to be the flowers. So from a texturing or shading perspective, that obviously makes the life a little bit easier. What you'll also notice, though, which it doesn't do, which would be nice, is that it's not going in and creating a separate group for each one of the plants. So if I now wanted to move just this one, I could, but I have to do it at the vertex level. And so, or you can select this group, go under polygons, and then go into a mesh separate, which would separate this poly object into all the different components that you could then recombine. So that's, again, a matter of your own workflow and how you want to deal with it. It's relatively simple to just select the object, and then in here, just start selecting verts on that plant, like so, so that I could go in and move this individual one somewhere else. But aside from that issue, we want to see, and again, this is now in 5. Let's hit 6. We get the texture back. We want to see what happened in Hypershade. So I'm going to go and open Hypershade. Here it is. And what we're going to see in here is 3 new shaders have been created. So we have corn bush flower shader, corn bush leaf shader, and corn bush shader, which is obviously the main stock. Now with that, the reality is, if I double click on it, is that these are just using Phong materials. You can see all 3 of them are Phong. That already makes me not like it. So I'm not a big fan of using Phong. So traditionally for years I really only use blends for everything, because you can make a blend look like any material. And now with Mental Ray I pretty much use the MIA material for everything except for the SSS materials for skin. So that's the first thing that we'd want to change. But looking in here, what are some things you might notice looking around? Well, all 3 of these shaders have a translucence set. And obviously for things like a leaf you would want some translucency. But as you might know, the translucency you get with a Maya shader like Phong or even Blinn is not very realistic or very good. So that's the first thing that you'll have a big improvement switching to MIA. Also, you'll notice that very little attention was placed on these shaders with specularity or reflectivity settings. You'll see each one of these have reflectivity set to 0.5, which is kind of high. And Phong shaders don't have any kind of BRDF or Fresnel effect built in, so that the reflection gets stronger as the surface turns away from the camera, which is something you're going to expect on most shiny objects. And plants obviously can be rather shiny. So we kind of have an issue there. Then if we graph some of these, you'll see that something that you may find useful is, while you may not like the shading engine being used, some of the textures could be useful. Now in this case it's just a ramp, which isn't, super exciting. While if we go to this shader, which is for the leaf, you'll see it has a shader that's a little bit more complicated looking, but the reality is it's just this ramp. And so this ramp is then just being multiplied, and if we go inside here you can see we have a multiply operation, another multiply operation, as well as another one. So it's going and taking the inputs here. So you'll see it's taking the out alpha of that ramp, and then it's going in and multiplying it by this number, 0.281, 0.246, kind of random, which is then going and being multiplied by this, which is also taking the out color, and then multiplying them by each other to create the specularity. Point being, it's a little convoluted and a little non-intuitive of a way to utilize this ramp to create some kind of transparency map for this leaf. Not very realistic. And then this is what's being used for color. It's just simple ramp that's being repeated a couple times. So the repeats that are in here If you go to the placement node, you'll see it just has repeat set to 2 in U. So another example of a shader is like, that's not very realistic, especially if it was close up. And then finally, there's the shader in here, which is, if we graph it, being used for the leaves at the top. It's basically the same shader. The only difference is they introduced a little bit of noise. So all of the shaders that are used for this plant are procedural. And so for a long shot, something far away, you might get away with it, but the fact that it's a Phong is a problem. So now let's go to another stroke and convert it to polys. So let's say we go to this corn. We're going to expect to get something similar with that. So modify, convert, paint effects to polygons, and then you can see it looks almost identical. So they're so similar looking that you might decide that, well, in the end, I don't necessarily need both of them in my plant library. You might be happy having just one of them because they are so similar. If we scroll in, we can see that there's some differences in the flowers at the top. So this one's a little bit more spread out looking. This one is more of like a tight little bunch. And so you could keep both of them for that reason, doesn't really matter. Let's go to this one, the flowering P. Modify, convert, paint effects to polygons. So this one, if we zoom in a little bit, looks kind of nice. And you'll notice clearly a file texture is being used. So if we select the geometry for that, you can see, zooming in, that there is a file texture with an alpha channel that's being applied to these individual cards, which immediately you can see is making it look a little bit more natural, a little bit more realistic. So if we want to take a look at the shaders that were created for that, I'll go and select the flowering P. I can then go to Hypershade. And then in here, you can see it created, again, 3 shaders for the flowering P. Flowering P shader, the leaf shader, and the flower shader, which is procedural, not really great for any kind of close-up. But right-clicking on the flower, you can see this texture that's being used. So the important thing to point out for that, where is this texture coming from? Double-click on it. It's coming from here, the brush images directory. So wherever Maya is installed, you will find that there's a directory called brush images that's full of images that are used by paint effects brushes. So you can leave them there, although what I did is I just went in, here's my project, and we're looking at the source images directory for my kit of parts project, and you'll see I just copied the brush images folder to here, just so that it's easier to browse and grab those if I want to use them. So there's quite a few, but they're all kind of tiny. That's probably the one negative, is a lot of these are very low resolution, or not very large. And if we take a look at icons, you'll see some of them are going to show because they're JPEGs and GIFs. The GIFs don't really want to show. Obviously the IF files, my Windows browser doesn't know what to do with them. And so in the end, you could go and convert these to something easier to use, but you'll see for what we're doing, it's not really a big deal once we start converting some of these things to MIA materials. So, all right. So now we've converted that one. So what's the deal with these strokes that are hidden as I convert it? Well, construction history still exists between the converted stroke and the poly geometry that we look at. So right now, with what we've created, or what we've converted to poly, let's say we zoom out a little bit, you'll see the scene has gotten a little bit slower because of that construction history. If you retain the history or the connection between the paint effect stroke and the geometry that's created, your scene will slow down a little bit. So you might want to get things to be in bounding box mode to speed them up. So why would you maintain the construction history? Only if you think you want to go back to the stroke and make changes for things like placement, seed value, whatever, or if you're going to use animation. That would be the main reason. If you're not going to have these be animated with any kind of wind or whatever, there's no reason to keep the construction history. So right now you can see that if I go to, let's say, our flowering P stroke, even though this doesn't get selected, if I go to the attribute editor for it, and I go and change, let's say, the seed value, you'll see it updates on my geometry inside here. So it's basically like still having the paint effect stroke. The difference is you can now render it with mental ray and ray trace shadows and make better shaders. So if we now switch back, I think we already did, to mental ray, and let's do a render, the ones that we converted to polygons are now going to want to render. So let's go and render that out. So there you go. So whatever is converted to poly renders, all the other ones are ignored. And you can see that the default shaders that Maya created are a little wonky, meaning we have a single directional light in the scene, but you can see that the specularity of them seems to be completely missing. And this weird transparency, that sort of repeated ramp that's put as transparency on this leaf, that's kind of weird looking. So they need a little bit of work. But now what we're going to do is convert the rest of these things to polygons. So, and I want to get rid of construction history. So I'm going to hit this button right here, construction history on or off. By turning that off, when I now take, let's say, something like this onion, and I convert it to a paint effect stroke, modify, convert, paint effects to polygons, there's now no construction history for that one. So if I go to the onion now, go to the attribute editor and change the seed value, nothing's happening. So the connection does not exist between the poly version that it was created and the original stroke. The stroke is still there, but it's hidden. So I could make it visible again, turn construction history on, and recreate the poly object. So, but again, for the library, that's sort of less important. It's once you were building a final scene that you might want construction history just for animation purposes. So construction history is off. I can also go in here and just decide, all right, I don't need these strokes anymore for the 4 that I've converted. So I could also just delete them, which would also delete the construction history. And you'll also see my scene is now far more interactive by turning the construction history off. So I'm going to now go to the rest of these and convert to polys. You can do it in one step, so I'm just going to select all of these strokes inside here. I don't necessarily have to avoid the curve, but all of the ones we haven't converted yet are selected, and then modify, convert, paint effects to polygons. And in my options, since it's set to 500,000 polys per stroke conversion, we're going to be safe to know everything gets converted. And with construction history off, obviously the scene is going to be very interactive once the conversion is done. So it just finished converting. Everything is fast. So I can now go and get rid of all these strokes. I don't really need them. And then importantly for us, the converted groups all have the name of the paint effect stroke they came from. So if I look at this library and decide, okay, well, I want that plant, I can see that's the rubber plant mesh. So what else is going to be different now? Let's go and turn off our resolution gate. Well, now that we've converted all of them to polygons, we're going to be able to see cases where textures have been used and where they haven't. So for example, we can see this plant, which is the bushes brush, has a leaf texture on it. A lot of these other things are procedural. So like this plant here does not have the creeper, or creeper leaf is what's selected there, but this is just the creeper brush, is using just a procedural. So we're just going to go and look around. We can see this has a nice texture on it as the default texture that comes from the brush library. So again, if I go in here and select that, go to Hypershade, we're going to have a lot more shaders now in here, as we can see, because it's created the shaders for all of the different brushes that we converted to polys. And then if I just go and graph for selected, you can see that the rubber plant leaf has this texture on it. There's actually no alpha channel. And if I go to that, we can see it's coming from the brush images directory. So it's really just a file texture that's going into a ramp. What's the ramp doing? You can see it's just giving changing the color a little bit. So this texture is multiplied by this. So you can see it's just going into the color gain on the ramp. And then that's going into a thong with translucence and blah, blah, blah stuff we're going to need to change. So we have all of these, and they're all useless. We basically would want to go in and create our own shaders for all of these objects. Some of them you'll be able to repurpose. So we can go in here and see like, well, this plant leaf, looks like that. Is that the same leaf that's on another plant? Well, it's different than that one, so that's going to be a different shader than this because it's a different leaf. But for example, the shader we create for the twigs that are inside here, so let's say like that, we could probably use the same shader that we create for this wood that's inside there, those branches, as we use for there. So just, it's kind of obvious that you're going to want to repurpose things wherever you can. But that's our next step. So let's go in here. We've created our little plant library. We've converted everything to polygon. We've got rid of construction history just so that our scene is quick. And so now I'm just going to go and save our scene out. And so this is going to be our plant library 02, just versioning. And now we're going to have to talk about shaders a little bit for our plants.